Thank you. That was great to hear the full, by the way. I haven't heard it for years, so it's sort of a fresh restart, fit and working again, which is exactly how I feel. I'm going to talk about some drawings we've made in recent years at East, and I'm going to use them to illustrate something about the relationship our practice brings between places and architecture. The somewhat circuitous title reflects an interest in what can be seen as a dynamic relationship between the development of ideas and their representation in drawings and in architecture. The drawings I'll show, I'm not going to read the whole time, but I'm going to read some parts of this because I wanted to sort of get some points across. So the drawings I'm going to show are all critical drawings in their aim, meaning they are trying to establish a kind of clarity about what they're showing. They're often as much speculative as propositional. And that to me is one of the key reasons for making drawings at all, that you have a closed loop between thinking, playing and proposing. It's never quite one thing and the process can sort of surprise you. And these drawings vary a lot in format and style. And I think this is interesting in the sense that whilst it's quite usual to refer to buildings in terms of typologies, it's harder to reduce places and urban situations down to such degrees of completeness. This resistance to completeness has a bearing on the nature of the drawings themselves, and indeed the design of our buildings and spaces. There are some projects here, and I'll talk about those, but I'll go quite quickly through them and mainly use the drawings as a framework. And just to say, it's not really about the drawings themselves, actually, but just to reflect a bit on the ways in which thinking about design manifests itself. So I'm just going to share my screen, if I can manage that. It's the one job I had to do, and I just need to press the right button. Is that okay? Excellent, great. It's a title slide because it's a lecture. This is an early drawing. This is a drawing that was about an existing situation, and defining what exists around a project is always part of the task. And there's something profoundly elusive about context in the sense that it's always moving, and in perceiving it and presenting it, you're necessarily affecting it. And in that sense, the architect has a responsibility to describe it as a living part of the project, rather than a neutral ready-made background to just dump your design into. And this so-called catch and steer drawing, catch and steer, a lovely term coined by Mark Greeley, was carried out at the start of one of our first projects at Borough High Street, and it uses the genre of documentary as part of the analysis of the project. In other words, it looks at the situation rather than designing anything, but this is a strange piece of documentary because the situation it looks at is not a static one. Instead, it combines a series of emerging proposals by others, including Transport for London's proposals and the then Jubilee Line station and bridge deck works. And it splices them together to show an emerging condition. This picture then reveals what would happen if, unchecked, the various projects were to happen independently. And the texture and the format of the drawing is deliberately Frankensteinian in its bolted together, or as we refer to it, spliced in quality, juxtaposing different drawing types by different authors. And it dramatizes the disjointedness of the city in the making, helping to prompt a review of such an uncoordinated outcome. And it propels an argument for coordinating efforts with consistency. And it's worth commenting on the shape of the drawing, which I kind of really love looking back on it, which is tailored to encompass only those spaces that were relevant to our project scope at Borough High Street. And this is a fundamental judgment in working architecturally, shaping your scope of interest with the drawing itself. A beautiful condition of high streets is that they are linear and somehow going somewhere. It looks like a kind of a bird, this particular drawing. And then I won't talk about these projects in detail, but this photo taken by David Conn beautifully holds a catalogue of all the components of the wildlife of public life that the Borough High Street project and pretty much all of the public realm projects we've ever worked on encapsulates. The proximity of commercial uses, cyclists, play, pedestrians, leisure, transport and work completely exacerbated by that pinched point, just where there's the side entry to one of the Dickensian yards that characterise Borough High Street. The proximity between the most challenging of these uses, the cars and the people, is reflected in the generous proportions of the curbs and the quadrants that mark the side entries and name the places. When the project was made 25 years ago, we've been back over the years to see how it's changed, and we always enjoy how it kind of disappears and gets rebuilt and remade, spliced in, like the drawing, cut in to the background. It's not just about the paving, of course, although there's something important about the care with which these were tailored. We took a lot of effort to use ordinary materials with great care. It was also about trying to find a way of engaging with the place, where to leave things be and where to intervene. And this process helped us to consider where, instead of just cutting in, we might create some foreground elements. And I think this handmade montage was productive. I remember making this with a scalpel. It took me ages to do the letters for London Bridge Station. It's slightly ambitious. This handmade drawing was productive in the sense of trying to dramatise the relationship between the given city. And it changed, it sort of literally changes the photocopy into a drawing by cutting into it and drawing on top of it. And again, this has been useful over the years as sort of understanding how to locate one's project, not to place one's own designs at the centre of things, and not to overburden one's designs with intended meaning or significance. Because of course, you know, we like our projects and we want them to be good. But some early drawings which we made with students and we made with early kind of ideas about London were sort of trying to find ways of reconceptualizing the city that exists, reconceptualizing, and by locating open and green spaces in this drawing, which has only 2 layers of information, it's possible to distill a sharp reading of what it meant to have such spaces exist in what is otherwise only ever imagined as a built-up metropolis. So these words come forward like chase, valley, plain, hill, forest, river. They're very evocative of spaces we all know, and the highly edited drawing is intended to stimulate the imagination. And of course, you start to wonder what else might be there. This drawing reminds us that London, if you didn't know, has a giant forest, although it's in 1,000 pieces. In a way, it's you can kind of decide what you're looking at, and you can make that very productive in terms of influence and influencing a project which is set within that context. We made some drawings which we've referred to over the years as hairy drawings. It's a funny title, but some of them are drawings which have been made together, and some of them are with many hands. Oh, hang on, I think I've dropped, yeah, here we are. So one of these types of hairy drawings is a memory drawing where we asked our students to draw the place where they lived, starting from their house and drawing outwards around the edges until the memory ran out. And Judith Losing has written a nice essay about that in our book, Expressing Interest. There's something really nice about exploring your own memory in drawing, because it simultaneously brings spaces forward in a way that becomes conscious. And in drawing it, you actually start to shape it, because of course you're only drawing what's important to you. This drawing of Barking, not a memory drawing, but a drawing after a long drive around with Stephen Bates and Jonathan Surgeson. I think Tim was there too, capturing ideas discussed on plan. And in a way, this is a slightly feverish thing to do, to kind of try to draw as you move around, as you actually it was after the day, thinking about what mattered. And it's in that place between proposition and reflection on what you've just seen. And it's a slightly unstable condition to be in when you're drawing like this. And actually some of the text, you can't read it there, but some of the text is a little bit saying what you're looking at, and a little bit saying what the consequence of that could be, spatially, in terms of use, in terms of proximity. And so it has a charge, it has a kind of vibrancy. And we found that useful when making them together or making them individually and then talking about them afterwards. I keep on pressing the wrong buttons here, but it's fine. It took a while for East to actually move towards architectural projects because, partly because of a wish to sustain an interest in the meanings of the wider city and landscape before diving in with architectural projects. And the urban investigations I'm talking about were fundamental in helping us take a perspective on what it means for buildings to engage with the public realm. And as we've developed our building projects, we've sought to maintain a critical perspective on the city context as shown in our architecture. So in a way, we take a city perspective on the buildings instead of the building looking out. For this early architecture foundation competition, this is a beautiful drawing by Matthew Ringgenberg, who unfortunately died very young. But this drawing resonates as something that keeps on being important to us, which is where private and public spaces meet, where the edges of housing, retail frontages, other uses, do they coexist? Do they engage? This is, of course, a very ambitious meshing together of public and private through some muse arrangements of a housing proposal set near Victoria Park. We even imagined that the residents of the flats could do a one-to-one rehearsal of their flat before they moved into it. And they could imagine how to lay out their own furniture. We've done a lot of work in high streets over the years, and high streets are amazing places because they're extremely rich in terms of use, vitality, diversity, and spatial qualities. And this drawing made for Wood Green, well, what's John saying? Cool, nice. This is fun, by the way, I'm enjoying this. The high street projects that run through London are about as rich as you could possibly imagine. And as you walk down them, it's almost impossible to remember everything you've seen. They're singular at one level, they're long and straight and thin, they're like Roman roads. You see along them, but the spaces and uses which go to make them up are often vulnerable, mixed in type, spatially very diverse, and as we know, not always about retail. And it's often about what's behind the street, round the back, that does as much to support the life of the high street as what is actually in the street itself. So again, this drawing is one of those slightly sweaty drawings where you realize you've got to do some work and you've got to commit and you've got to kind of find out what you're looking at. This is a 3-kilometer project. It was a very busy project working with Harrow and TfL and all sorts of consultants and just trying to get a sense of what it means to improve something with, I think this was a £4 million project. It's a lot of money, but you have to do a lot of things. And so what we enjoyed was that actually there are all sorts of aspects to a high street. In a way, it's like a box of chocolates, a really big one. And you haven't yet worked out where the flavors are coming from and what they're like and whether you like them. So buses, green spaces, nighttime uses, acorns which have rolled down from the ancient woodlands at the top of Wood Green, which you can sit on, bronze acorns, a refurbished library frontage which appears in Pevsner as a rather lovely modern building, completely forgotten about, overclad, rendered, signed. Muffer developing a next phase on this, so there's a kind of lovely sense of evolution to this space. The space itself uses reused materials. The tree, of course, is always there. That's lovely. A pub, a very run down at the time or struggling, vulnerable sort of institution, which is an absolute landmark along the high street. And we kind of cleaned it up a little bit, put a sign on it, overclad it. No, we didn't overclad it. We kind of put some lighting across it. It's a slightly stringy overcladding, so it looks good at night. And you can begin to see in this photo, there's a sort of an array of bits and pieces that come forward. Just in the foreground, there's a bollard that's fallen over, and there's a clock. And what that's about is trying to bring a pub garden forwards, using the Victorian elements of the pilasters and the columns and the bases as pieces, and we copy them and we reflect them, we bring them out, and then we score into the ground some channels around the trees to give them some drainage, and tries to almost domesticize a piece of public space to make a public moment which you can use in all sorts of different ways. The new river is not far away. This was a beetle house, which is also a new fence for a vicar, and it tells you where the river is. And we worked with a lot of shop owners to spend a bit of money, not much money, and we work very much with the shop owners themselves to celebrate the incredible diversity of the food that's available down Green Lanes. It's an amazing place. But of course, it's not always high streets. It's any space you can think of. And in Farringdon, we made an urban design strategy. And again, there's this slight kind of confrontation with the project at an early stage where there's a brief and people seem to know what they're talking about and what they want you to do. But of course, actually, no one really knows what they want to do. Everyone's asking you to work out what the brief might be really about. And so we've sort of found that sometimes a drawing comes out that tries to make some sense of the place. And then this one was about thinking about the big institutions, the deep plots like the Barbican and the hospital and the college, which are not inaccessible, but they are like big cutouts of the city. And the yellow in this diagram actually are some of the more publicly vibrant and easy to use spaces. Of course, the rail and the road space, you can't go into the railway space, but you can see it. And actually there are some verges along the edge of it where you could actually do a little bit of development whilst keeping the views of St. Paul's clear. So that drawing back there was about kind of large scale, chunky ideas of space, trying to get a sense of the relationships of those. And then this one's like a paper doily. It's a fine-grained mesh of 3 different streetscape palettes, which we had to coerce together and understand the delicacy of this place, and to try to simply make good crossings, good lighting, good streetscape and furniture and decluttering and so on. But into this picture, this was also about trying to encourage people to think about where to build and where to make a great big plate that stretches across the railway, and where to use the rooftop of an existing building, maintain the views of St. Paul's, and kind of, 60% of it is here already, and that's often the way with these projects. This is a housing project we've been working on with HMM in Hackney. It's on site at the moment, and again, we're working on the public realm, and in this case, designing the affordable housing in the corner, 15 units of the affordable housing. And what this drawing was about was trying to get a detailed textural sense of what was there. The utility covers, the in situ concrete which was exposed, the trees, the water, to be able to then have the confidence to say, well, actually, therefore it matters to connect down to the edge with the same in situ exposed concrete. And we take on the kind of informal, industrial, rough character, the sort of semi-found quality of that. And this is a recent markup of the work which is on site. We got a drawing which showed some movement joints by the engineers. And it suddenly seemed to me desperately important to do an overlay of this, whereby the joints of the concrete would feel a little bit more like the thing is stretching down to meet the water, and just the arrangement of the joints means that you don't sort of box yourself into a space between the buildings, but you have this slightly open, floating ground that is part of the bigger context. The buildings are CGI. We could talk about CGIs a little bit. Of course, that's a familiar type of drawing. They come too early these days often, and ideas come afterwards, which is not a good way round. This one came late, so we had the ideas already, which I am pleased to say. But I just wanted to show you this drawing, which was a way of trying to catalogue some of the ideas in a model. It's a drawing of a model about the building, and all it's saying really is that the salmon painted wood opposite Foreman's Fish Factory and the different ledges give you a scale of the Victorian warehouses not far away, and every face of the building has to do something differently, and the ground is busier than the upper parts, and when you get to the top there's a crown, and you look around and you get amazing views. So I'll show you that. I look forward to showing you that another time when it's finished. This housing project alongside Levitt Bernstein and Adam Khan in Peckham, which has got planning now. I think it's going ahead soon. I don't think we're going to be designing it, but we design it up to planning. And the lovely quality of this scheme, I think, was that it tried to look at the spaces between the buildings, the housing, and it looked at a kind of reuse of the ground, of the spaces. In Peckham, you have these kind of spaces behind the shops, behind the frontier of the high street, which gets much looser. And we kind of played into that. And we made a couple of drawings that said that we could enjoy the recent archaeology of the artifacts which get knocked down in making these buildings. So we sort of treat old brick walls and bits of ground as a sort of Roman archaeology, and we reconstruct those to make something careful and special. And then the building itself, this diagram is simply saying that the ground is rough, the middle is regular and street-like, and the top is like a kind of setback, sky-coloured building. Yeah, and you get this kind of effect. And this is really just, you know, it's trying to make some sense of something that's rational, not too funny, not too clever, meaningful, and using drawings to try to assert that idea. Not this drawing, but the one before, to me, is the more important drawing. This project, it's been recently completed, and it's a hotel we made in West Ham Lane. And this drawing was fairly fundamental to us because we realized the site was in the round and we had to work at all sides. And so what this is saying is that the wall facing the recreation ground is flat, like a napped flint, shallow, hard up, powerful, proud, as a foil, or you could say a kind of companion to the kind of spreading recreation ground opposite. And the beige coloured space is behind a more informal 1940s buildings, 1980s buildings and 60s, yards, green spaces. And so there's this kind of sense of what do the facades do? What do they have to perform in the city? How can we make friends with the bad 80s building? And also, as this ground floor showed, how can we try to make the ground go beyond the scope of the red line of the building plot of the planning application? And this, you can see on the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This one here is particularly interesting because this was about getting out of the community space on the ground floor into the green space, which was underused, the 1960s space. This was on a bus, suddenly realizing that actually instead of using 2 bricks, we could use 2 mortars and use the same brick to get this relationship between this flat front and this slightly more baroque side. And these were just trying to understand how the windows would sometimes be formal or sometimes might drift. And so here's that moment where we actually persuaded the client and the council to allow there to be doors in the side. You wouldn't believe how difficult it was to get that agreement, so that we could actually get out into that green space, which is not owned by the client. This is that front opposite the park, the side. And these are David Grandorge's photos, which I really enjoy. He sort of is so good at bringing the rest of the city back into the project, this green canopy in particular, and the buildings around are really, I feel, joining in with the building. You can see at the back there, the windows are starting to drift slightly. So CGIs I mentioned a minute ago, and they're kind of annoying things because they're so persuasive, and we're making them all the time. And that's maybe just got to be fine because that's what we'll continue to do, isn't it? But I think we've got to find a way of making other sorts of drawings which are powerful, communicate to clients, and which are, if they're going to be early, then they've got to say something exciting. They've got to get the clients excited about what the ideas are, not just what the image is. And there's a worry that CGIs, if you keep on using them, if you build too much, it's almost like architecture is using architecture to make architecture. And this doesn't feel like that's going to grow. So I wanted to just quickly show this image, which was a project we did in Gothenburg for a river city in the future, which could flood. And this is a kind of vision. It's an idea of what it might be like to go towards this city. And this drawing simply says the public realm could be mixed up into the buildings above as it floods. So it pre-programs a floodable invitation. It pulls the public realm up into the buildings in these sort of yellow areas. We made a project in West Croydon a few years ago, and it was a very tricky one. It was really challenging because it was really, there wasn't much public realm there. There wasn't much space, and it was about addressing a transport hub in West Croydon. You might know it, tram, trains and buses, basically. This drawing told us what our inventory was, what we had to use, what we could, what our site was about, and we sort of enjoyed the fact there was almost nothing to work with. And this drawing constructs a kind of scenography about the edges of the place, which of course it always exists. We made play of calling, describing a sort of Croydonness, because it's so vulnerable, delicate, vibrant and historic and happening. It's an amazing place. And so we tried to kind of make this drawing about the edges and about the scenography. And so here you've got the connection between the tram and the train on the left. And this shows you how we widened the footway. We made a fence that recalled the arched shop fronts around the corner. And we made a kind of background which would reflect Croydon back to itself. It wouldn't displace it, and it would become something that would grow. You can grow plants up it over time, but it would have this sort of different, it would play with these scales. So you've got a big hoop top fence, you've got a little big bonsai tree, and you've got this sort of civil edge to the place. You've got a clock which is celebrating a very ordinary corner in Croydon, and we used the standard streetscape palette of materials, the black and the white, to make a sort of civic rhetoric, if you like, but also we looked at Richard Wentworth's book to remind us that this is all going to go wrong when people relay this paving. It's going to go back in the wrong order, so we have to enjoy the fact that that could be okay. We kind of laid it slightly wrong to begin with. And this lovely photo by Nick Clark is the back of that fence, actually, and it's a bit of where the ground is coming, and they don't really meet. And this is a sort of photo that reminds us of this incompleteness, this fact that you're never going to get it done. You're never going to finish the place. Here we make use of the church. We reflect the rose window by making a hole in the wall of the bus station. And that's all great. And so what I wanted to just go through, how long have we had actually so far? Is that 46 minutes already?
No, you've had half an hour.
Half an hour, perfect. Okay, I've got a different reading, great. I just wanted to show some of our students' work over the years, because there's something funny about being a student and being a practitioner. When you're a student, you're expected to think, you're expected to make drawings out of what you think, and you're expected to do lots of those. And when you're in practice, it's not that people don't do it, and there's some very good architects who draw amazingly, but somehow the culture of taking time to do these drawings is not recognized enough, and it doesn't, and it's a shame. I think that, you know, that's why I'm showing these, because I think this drawing, for example, which is still in Croydon, is an incredible effort at showing the relationships between a flyover, an office building, and some housing. It sort of says it in the drawing by making equivalent these different structures. This one here, still in Croydon, is simply a celebration of one student who didn't like Croydon to start with, finding some tessellated tiles, sort of remnants of the 60s texture of Croydon, and actually turning this into a whole project where the building stands in this texture and the whole ground is sort of celebrated in that way. And we also worked in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and somehow this drawing shows the block. And we looked at blocks, streets and blocks. And what this does is to say that the liveliness of the block, well, what's lovely is the block is not there. It's just inferred by what's around it. So you're drawing around the edges, you're not drawing the site. This one shows those elevations in more detail. And again, there's this sort of fairly intense thinking moments. It's that bit where you can do it in half an hour. This block drawing I really like because it's somehow all of those backyards, those entries, those deep industrial sheds in Sao Paulo, but also other cities that you can imagine. These are all kind of not necessarily place specific. They're kind of ideas about how to show a grain. And I really like this drawing because it was showing in the block where the yards were, where the social spaces were, the staircases, the lobbies, the areas where you get light down into a well. And this comes out of that study in the sense that the notion of proximity, actually I skipped over that drawing. It was a drawing I could go back to, but maybe the main thing is just to say that there's always this idea of proximity in the city. And proximity isn't just about being next to something. It's about the relationship between these different uses, and they can be quite different sometimes. So this was about stretching this sort of deep lobby space back into buildings and saying that's still about urban proximity. That's still about public space, the stairwell, the yard entrance, and being able to pull and push that, to stretch that proximity, I think is part of the architect's task. This particular view of that example, where there's this yard going deep into a proposal at the back, and then there's this public forum on the roof in front of you, and then there's this little platform in front of you where people are sitting. What that does is it reminds you that the city is three-dimensional. You can start to imagine occupying it. And actually this particular view, this drawing reminds me of one of my favorite projects of all time, which is Florian Bagel, Philip Christou and ARU's project for the Half Moon Theatre. It's a project which invites you from the street. It plays with scale. It's about people. It celebrates everyday domestic life with literally with a theatrical intent in this particular case. But what it does, you can just see through the doors which are open, it has this little house onto the street, which is another scale, and it tells you about what's to come. This drawing tells you about street corners, and it is about walking. It's something you can only experience in time. And it was about saying that public space is not all in the same place at the same time. It's not a central fact, sort of fixed fact. It's a kind of process and an environment and a series of little spaces adding up. This one too says that towers can be surprisingly friendly with long pieces of infrastructure. They can be companions. This is about a kind of reedy walk and how that edge might reflect itself in a building next to it, which evokes in its facades that quality. This is a slack car park near a Tesco's. And this is a detail, really lovely detail of a building which takes on the tectonics of a curb, of a street with curbs and flints and stones set into it. And it kind of, and also even the doorway is lined with the same sort of curb. So it's kind of about saying how you set out the infrastructure for spaces. The curbs are the bit where you have to really make a choice and a decision, and the stones are somehow able to find their own place within that context. In this case, a sill frames a city. This is the same place, viewed differently, inside and outside. This is a site in Belvedere, cement factory, where a student decided to cut in proposals which evoked the same gantries and kind of cranes as part of her proposal. And you can see the paper is almost being destroyed by this sellotape and scalpel effect. And then actually when we were doing that year, Belvedere, we were looking at big sheds, and we thought, where's the only place we could go on a field trip to look at this kind of place? And it was Marfa in Texas, where you have these sheds in these big desert spaces. Again, it's about scale, about this kind of notion of simultaneity of scales. So I'm going to just walk you through. I've got one or two more projects, and then we can kind of talk about things after. Scrubs Lane was a project we worked on for the OPDC. It was a framework. It was to guide planning. And this photograph by Jason Orton somehow collects together all the parts of the city in all its difference in one place. Victorian industrial bridge, the tree, the community garden, the canal, and the sheds on the right. I think you can just see those. And walking along Scrubs Lane, what became clear, it's a busy, noisy, dirty road, and every part of it is different, and there's very little promise about it, and yet it's set to change. And it's got this incredible, magnificent cemetery to the right. Kensal Green is one of the Magnificent Seven. So this sketch actually found its way into the eventual area action plan, which is unusual because quite often we do these drawings which are a bit scatty or a bit not really resolved, and people think that's not really a thing. But this one stayed in because it somehow said you've got big life on the left and contemplative ways on the right, and it somehow held together the way in which we could talk about development along Scrubs Lane. This was one of those drawings trying to work out who's there, what's going on, what matters, and what sort of shape it makes, which then touches on who's there. And in developing the place, making a section out of words, you start to say, we said in the document, that it mattered that people could be working, local people with businesses and industrial uses could be on the ground floor, they could pay less rents, the housing above, the quiet backs to the right and next to the cemetery, the big life, the car giant stuff is to the left, and there's this sort of sectional mix. And so these drawings help to convince the client and actually community consultation that this mattered. This drawing was about realizing there were going to be some tall buildings there. And it was about saying, well, you've got the cemetery in front of you and you've got this wildlife over there. And perhaps the best thing we can do is to say that you're only allowed extra tall buildings if you can bring a connective public realm to connect the cemetery to car giant, east-west. And Scrubs Lane otherwise gets developed in this way I said with the section. And so this way you get this kind of profiled, place-specific condition that goes back to Jason Orton's photo in a way. It starts to assemble a series of differences in proximity. So you can hold the qualities of life of the place together instead of making it homogeneous. There's another project we've been working on for a long time, which is in Harrow. And this was again an area action plan, which we started off with, called the Heart of Harrow. And this was important because it set the tone for development through Harrow and Wealdstone. And of course, the place is this metro land, this dreamy work and live, leisure, countryside, this movement between the two. There's always this sort of distance inferred by that you work somewhere and you live somewhere else and they're effortlessly connected. And this particular picture here is about somehow showing the dream of choice and the ability of people to coexist in that way. And there's another even deeper connection here where you're looking from Southwark towards Harrow on the hill. And there's this amazing maypole in the foreground, which I just noticed today, actually. I've seen it, but I hadn't noticed it in the way that we could do, because it made me think that maybe the chimney could have maypole quality. Anyway, so so there's actually the steeple of the church, but there's also, of course, Kodak in Harrow. The paper factory closed down 7 years ago when the prices of paper fluctuated, and it was always vulnerable, and it's closed. However, the chimney will stay, there's new housing going there. And this follows on from the area action plan which we made, whereby we tried to establish what the ground was about, like literally the ground, the whole big picture. What sort of place is it? We made this model where we tried to upset the shape. And so just to say quickly what the area action plan was, and then I'll touch on a couple of other bits. So at the south, you got Harrow, and on the north, you got Wealdstone, and you got Station Road linking them. And it's about understanding what's there. And then you start to understand the potential to make relationships between the elements that are already there. You've got Headstone Manor, lots of green spaces, lots of local communities. There's tons of food. There's lovely cinemas and things. And this drawing starts to try to shape public realm projects around these developments. It tells you about these many thousands of homes that are going to come forward. And you get this picture. You get this sort of picture of Harrow at the south becoming more of a metropolis, Station Road in purple running up through there, Civic Centre is in orange, and then you go through further north through this green route through where the Kodak site used to be, and then you can end up at Headstone Manor, which is an amazing place to visit. And then we got involved with a number of other clients in developing this, and so we started to look at affirming this kind of big green route that runs through the landscape and adjoins this new development. And this drawing sort of bolts together Persimmon, London and Quadrant, Barratt, and council housing in a single place to try to test this opportunity. And then as we started to get more involved in this north part, in the Kodak site, we started to think that maybe this thing that happened with Station Road, where you had this lovely cinema and you had these sort of buildings along the way which seemed like they were vulnerable and one-offs, we could make some special local delicacies, some special creatures which would adjoin the green route amidst all of the main housing that would come with it. So these are kind of some of the special buildings which would signify these moments where you move along the green route. This drawing shows the kind of landscape seeping between the buildings on the right. So you can just about see the energy centre there. The energy centre reuses the chimney. That's a building we're working on. And to the right, you've got this sort of matrix of new housing, podiums, green streets, and this sort of deep mesh of what we're trying to say is that the landscape runs under the buildings. That's really important. And we've been trying to say that in all sorts of ways. And because we've been working on a few of the buildings and the landscape, we've been able to somehow narrate this in a way that was less about you talk about the buildings and we'll talk about the bits between. This is constantly about an attitude towards the edges of the front doors, the stairs to the podiums, getting up there, looking out. And so it's really complex, and it's taken 10 years and the conversation's still going. What's happening at the moment is it's being built. All sorts of architects involved alongside us. But this one shows two projects by us. It's the housing in the foreground with the 3 towers, and the chimney in the beyond is the energy centre. And these two buildings, somehow, they're completely different from each other, but maybe they've got something in common. They got kind of sky and landscape between them. That seemed to be important. So they're different, but they both contribute to this sort of green route. And we wanted to sort of think about actually, I'm just going to quickly read this out because I wrote this down because every time I say it, it's a bit different. And there's something nice about the landscape, the kind of, in terms of materiality, we thought of the bigger landscape, and we imagined the form of the building to be like a ball of clay dug out of the ground with a complex form, but a simple materiality, similar tones in matte or shiny finishes like you would get if you scraped clay out of the ground. And I have to thank my partner Rolly, who's watching this, because she made it in raku, and Judith made it before the raku, so there's kind of a combined effort there. It's a really nice piece. I showed this to the members. I handed it round as a housing proposal, and they kind of liked it. It's got a plastic plinth. It's not just the datum buildings above. There are ideas about the depth of the facades, the muddiness, the texture, and the sky between. So the CGI start to show you that you've got this kind of rolled up clay ball. You've got this sonography. The facades are busy because it's got a health centre in the front, and you've got these maisonettes at the sides. And so you're starting to see the two projects together. And I really hope this goes ahead. London and Quadrant project got planning permission, but at the moment it's on hold, but hopefully it'll go ahead. One of the interesting things was about the flats. They have views in all directions. They're double aspect and triple aspect. The podiums are complex because the site is triangular. And so that brings the landscape up into these podiums in this complex way. And inside, we wanted the windows to be sometimes vertical and sometimes horizontal to get to sort of exacerbate the sense of choice, different ways to look out, different ways to get light in. And actually the client was not so happy with these triangular flats for a while. And we made these models and we drew over the top. And it was these which persuaded them that they were now really happy about it, and their favourites, they told us. So that was nice. The project, and you know, look forward to showing you this another time. The energy centre is on site. It's going to be a big shed. It's a community use. It's an incredible building. It's slightly frightening in its scale, actually, because it shows you the green space and the bigger landscape are even bigger. But it's really exciting. That's going ahead soon. They'll be back on site soon. That's what it'll look like. Again, what's going on is that the landscape is somehow scraped and rough and recycled and not too manicured and goes beyond the building. And I've just got one project and a couple of other slides, and then I'm going to finish. In fact, it's not even a project. This is just to say, I mean, it is a project, but I'm not going to talk about it as a project. What I wanted to say about this is it's a housing scheme in East London. It's a really exciting one. and we were working on it in the early stages with Hans van der Heyden, and now we've sort of gone further, and we're getting through to another stage of development with this, where we look at these two plots. There's also a community use, but the important thing to say about this is that it starts to play into this, this housing landscape, understanding what the spaces are, the big yards, the strong streets, the relationships between the ground floor and the balconies and the frontages, and could we make a blank facade at the bottom, and could we let this help to address and extend and join in with the general structure of this urban place. And we've got this courtyard, which is a kind of an oval. It's shared by everyone. And what I wanted to say about this is that there's this process going on where we're developing these CAD drawings, but Judith made this really nice overlay. And I think this is so, I mean, everyone does this. It's nothing kind of cosmic really, but it's sort of just part of that thing of, it matters whether the landscape locks into a facade, whether a joint leads you towards an entrance, whether the materiality is going to work, whether the planting helps you to keep away from someone's kitchen window. All of those things, those interfaces between everyday life, privacy, and public access are so hard to get right. And you've got to, and you can't just draw it on the computer. So you've got to somehow reflect on it. And drawings like this don't take long, but they do require a lot of concentration, I think. They're kind of hard to do amidst the day, but they're completely crucial. And I'm just finishing on this, which was a study to think about London. And really the purpose of this was to think about the public realm first as a condition of London, rather than it's a lovely historic place and you do things in it. So this is somehow assembling in an imaginary London the aspects of the place that we all know, incredibly familiar, and you imagine a sort of a shape of it. And then you, of course, have it changed. Things come to sites, different ownerships start to evolve. There's a certain proximity which might be accidental. Buildings get built. And of course, people do understand that when you build a building, you've got to make a kind of public space that comes with it. Everyone gets that. But actually, I think we can do more than that. And this drawing was somehow trying to assert that instead of doing more at the time of the development, you do more from the outset through policy, through kind of ideas drawn, which can stimulate the imagination and make you realize that by bringing ownerships together, combining monies from different places, being more imaginative and ambitious, understanding the quality of life, you can start to imagine that the public realm comes first, and then the building comes after that, and then you invigorate the city that exists, is the kind of mantra with this sketch. It's a sort of an effort to try to just sort of, I mean, it was done quite quickly, actually. It was done in one of those moments where you just think, God, what do I actually mean when I keep talking about the public realm? And this doesn't necessarily define it, but it helps to say what I mean in one way. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks so much for sharing that collection of projects and drawings. I think if anyone has any questions, please post them into the chat box. But I wanted to start by kind of linking back to last night's lecture with Neil McLaughlin. He said that kind of in this time, one of the things that has kept the team working and feeling like they're together is this act of kind of collective drawing across Zoom or platforms like this. Have you felt the loss of sketching together as a practice? Yeah, definitely. And actually, we hold office meetings regularly through the week. And one thing we did was to get everyone to show us, like to the camera, a drawing they'd done. It had to be a hand-drawn drawing, and it had to be something they were working with. And it could be really mundane, you know, like a little markup or something. And it was really healthy to do that. And I think everyone liked it. And then we did another version where we could only show a drawing that had been sent by someone else to them. And so then they showed those. And yeah, we've missed it. We're always talking about each other's drawings, even if it's on the screen as well, you know, pointing and looking at
computer drawing. But if you don't do that, then you're working in isolation and you don't have that seeded energy that is critical. And I mentioned the word critical at the start. I mean, these are critical things. They're not sort of pictures or presentations. It's part of a process. And you know, the dialogue is usually with a pen in your hand fairly quickly. And if it's badly drawn, it doesn't matter. It's still communication. So yeah, we've missed it. We've tried to factor it in a bit.
I've got a question from Dylan, but he doesn't have his mic on, so I'm just going to ask it to you. What do you think that the bird's eye drawing, why do you think that the bird's eye drawing that you use frequently is, sorry, other than, sorry, it's just worded strangely.
Yeah.
But I think he's asking about the kind of axonometric point of view that you often use and kind of why you're going back to that every time, or not every time, but often.
Yeah, I think.
And what qualities does it have that perhaps a CGI perspective doesn't?
You get an overview. I suppose it's obviously true that if you float above the ground, you float above the city, you have a distance. So that's sometimes bad. But actually, if you just try to imagine looking, then it could be from any angle. I mean, sometimes you sort of feel like looking through a door, like that student view through the window, I think captures both an intimate proximity and then the scope or the scape of the city. So I think the short answer is you're trying to kind of establish a reading of scape and to ask yourself what that means. But I think quite often, there are combinations of drawings, and if so these, and in fact I was sort of realizing that the way in which this presentation has come is kind of linear, but quite often these are combined. So you'll have an overview drawing, but then you'll have a kind of a sketch of a doorway, you know, and that's really important to say, that it's not sort of, that's one of the things I really wanted to say, that the relationship between urban design and architecture is like, it's like that. It's not sort of Tuesday I'll do the urban thing and then by Friday I'll get to the door handle. It's all together.
Got a question from Jay Morgan. I'm going to unmute you now. Jay?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I wasn't expecting this.
Hi.
Hi, Julian.
Good background.
Welcome to the new normal.
Great.
I guess I was trying to understand that, you know, some of the earlier sketches remind me of stuff we used to do as students in the 80s. They're very, very charged with graphic, and they're very, I think, indicative of maybe the kind of space that you're imagining, which I find really wonderful. It's very hard to get students to do something like that these days, in my experience. So I was just wondering, how do you engage your hand sketches, or how do you educate your clients to engage with the hand sketches as a means to kind of really engage with your architectural thought?
I think the main way that we do it is we just show them the sketches. You know, we pin them up and we point to them, we talk about them. I sort of take them seriously, and the worse they are, the more seriously I take them. So sometimes I deliberately choose a really bad sketch. I don't mean bad, you know, it's like it's maybe uncertain. It's cheeky. It's a kind of cheeky thing to do a really simple drawing of a project which maybe the client is really freaking about, and it has to be on time. But I think it sort of upsets the rhythm in a really positive way. And so I've found that actually the best thing you can do is talk about a drawing which they've never seen before and mean it. And then you can really just be completely straightforward. This is why we think it should be doing this on the street. Otherwise, yeah, you're doing plans and sections and elevations, and it takes a long time, and you'll get there that way as well. You know, that works too. But I find it can upset the rhythm in a really helpful way. Like that clay model, I sort of took it along to a big presentation, and I realized I didn't really dare to show it. And then I did dare, and I sort of handed it around, and it was really a little bit touch and go. And it just really was great. Because people aren't stupid. They get it. They get an idea. Everyone gets ideas. Maybe sketches a little bit challenging because people don't know what they're doing, but that gives them a raw power. That's why I think architects should do it more by hand, because it's got a raw power. Everyone expects people to draw on the computer. They can do it, architects do it brilliantly, but it doesn't have a raw power. It doesn't have that uncertainty. There was someone I met, a client I met, who sat next to me, and he started sweating when I was drawing. And he said it was, to him, like driving a Formula One racing car, like the terror of drawing. And it wasn't a good drawing, but he was just experiencing vicariously the terror of drawing. And it really made me realize that it's sort of powerful because you can draw what you want. You know, it's like, yeah, I think I'll draw that. And so it's nice to realize that you can communicate in that way. Yeah. So clients, it's fine. They're easy. They're just people.
Thank you.
A question from Patrick Crow. About to unmute you now. Patrick. Okay, it doesn't look like Patrick is here, but he was saying, actually, I think I'm just going to go to Ellis for the last question, because I know he wanted to ask one and then we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Hi, Julian.
Hi.
I was just thinking again back to last night's talk with Neil McLaughlin, and he made this observation about, he was talking about drawing, and made an observation about certain architects, he named Peter Salter and Henri Marius, as being architects for whom the act of drawing and of building is so completely integral that in a way, perhaps with both of those architects, you wonder if it's not ultimately the drawing itself that has the greater charge than the building.
Yeah.
I guess a two-part question I wanted to ask about, to what extent do you feel that your graphic language informs the form of the architecture, and maybe you could say something about what kind of drawing styles, or whose drawing graphic language excited you when you were starting out. I mean, those two kind of spring to mind as reference points, but I also think of the Smithsons' work when you were showing a lot of things today. They have a similar interest in describing territories, and similarly a sweet tooth for metaphors, which you have, I think, as well, of talking about a project as a tapestry or as a clay ball. Could you just talk a little about who other architects who had, and your thoughts about their kind of graphic language and what you might have learned from them? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And actually, I mean, I think in terms of the relationship between the drawings and the architecture, there's something, I feel like saying something slightly perverse about that actually, in the way the drawings are almost to be discarded, there's a kind of process by, what sometimes happens is we'll do a drawing and then we'll have a kind of quite heated discussion in the office in response to the drawing, and then the drawing goes in the bin. I mean, not literally, because we sort of worried that they might be kept, but there's not a Morales-like sort of seamless sort of seeping into the architecture, I would say. I think it's more of a critical distance. And actually, one thing I was going to do with this presentation, another version of this, was to use many more other people's drawings. And I felt that it might be a bit heavyweight because really you've got to do them justice. But some of the drawings, I mean, Tony Fretton's on after this, and Tony's drawings to me have always been moving. I mean, you know, since the late 80s and early 90s, because they somehow were not about themselves. They jolted you into thinking about the consequence of what they were meaning. And I like that idea that the drawings almost displace ideas towards some other process. They don't somehow hold it all together and, you know, you put it on a wall and then it's all brilliant. I think Tony's were somehow like kind of bouncing ideas away from themselves, or reflecting ideas. Certainly the Smithsons drawings are lovely. Tony's going to show some Leverance drawings later. I love those drawings because they seem like someone's banging a bell, you know, they're so to the point. they go to the heart. And I think there's something about when you see someone drawing so adeptly, but it's that you no longer see the drawing, you see the thing they're up to, well, the thing they're after. And that's what I don't think I'm that good. I don't think I'm able to always do that, but that's what I'd like to do. And that's what I like to see other people do. And sometimes it happens more when you scribble on someone else's drawing while they're doing it.